Hi, Brad. Hi, Jeremy. It's really good to have you guys here today. I'm
It's good to
looking
be here.
forward to this discussion about love. Um, I talked with Jeremy a while back about the idea of the two great commandments, love God and love thy neighbor. And I heard Brad on Paul Vanderklay's channel last week talking about the three great loves of the Trinity. And I thought this would be a very interesting conversation. So I was hoping that each one of you could give maybe a 2 or 3 minute intro to yourself and then explain your idea. And then after you both explain your idea, then we'll see what we can do with it together. How does that sound?
Great.
That sounds great. You
Okay.
want to go first, Jeremy? Because I'm afraid if I start going, that I'll ramble a little bit. So I'll let you
Sure.
set the pace for me.
Yeah. So I grew up Mormon, but then eventually left that church and was an atheist for many years, and then ran into Jordan Peterson, and we all know that story. So now I'm a catechumen in the Orthodox Church, and going to be joining that probably in about a year or so. But it takes a while to go through that process. But anyway, a concept that's always stuck with me from early on in my religious upbringing. I was actually a Mormon missionary, and while I was there, I kind of just ran into this idea. It just kind of stumbled onto it and just had this kind of sudden insight into the idea that the two great commandments, and this kind of ties into learning more of a symbolic worldview and learning more about, like, Jonathan Pageau's worldview and about the traditional mindset of philosophy, and in studying philosophy, and it's the idea that the two great commandments, if you take love God as the order component, or the the heavenly order, and then you take love your fellow man as the potential, the chaos, the randomness that's around us, and that you have to follow both of those. So you have to embrace the order and embrace the chaos, the unpredictable, and then balance those two. That's the way to really find spiritual balance. And it's been an idea that's really helped me throughout my life. Even when I was an atheist, I still considered that to be pretty foundational to my worldview, in that if you think of structure as like Pharisaical rules or law of Moses, and you think of the chaos, or the love your fellow man as that unknown potential and the unpredictable that people throw at you all the time. You can't just have a list of rules for dealing with people, because you're going to constantly be running into new people that will challenge those rules and put you in weird situations that the rules can't account for. And I saw that when I was a missionary. They gave you pretty specific rules that you have to follow, and there were times where the rules would kind of contradict each other, and we had to, there was the whole concept of the spirit of the law and the letter of the law. And to me, this concept of love God as structure and love your fellow man as the unpredictable, and then learning to balance those two, and you almost become a mediator of the two, really fit in with principles in Taoism. And then also, a lot of Jordan Peterson's talks are about that idea of keeping one foot in order and one foot in chaos, and kind of writing that divide. And John Vervaeke as well, really, that's basically the flow state, from his point of view, from his philosophy. So that's what I ran into, and it's proved to be a really useful framework, not only in my religious life, but in my work life, because I work in custom fabrication, where everything we build is unique and one of a kind. There's definitely a balance of structure and flexibility that you have to have in a shop that builds custom one-off manufacturing items. So anyway, so it applies to both my religious life and my work life.
So could you just run through the thing about the architecture of a pagoda?
Oh yeah, sure. So one really interesting thing that I learned actually later was that pagodas, they stand for hundreds of years in earthquake zones. And the reason they do is they would take a tree and use the tree as the core of the pagoda, and they would build each floor tied to the tree. So each floor is connected to the tree itself, but the floors themselves are not connected to each other. They just rest on each other and can slide. So when you have an earthquake that moves the tree and quakes it, all of the floors of each floor, each of the building can slide on each other. So you have the structure of the tree, and then you have the flexibility of the floors themselves. And if you look at the cross, the shape of the cross itself in Christianity has the vertical component of love God, the horizontal component of love your fellow man. And there's an aligning. Jonathan Pajot talks about this. There's the aligning force of God, and then you have the gathering in force of love your fellow man. That's the horizontal component of the cross. So it's interesting how many tie-ins there are to this once you start kind of seeing it.
Yeah, I liked the that you threw in the order and chaos, because that was one of the things that I was going to ask. I watched your conversation between the two of you and the conversation, Jeremy, that you had with Paul, and that was one of the things that I was wondering was, when he says structure and flexibility, do those map onto order and chaos?
Yes,
The way you described it, I kind of figured that was the case, but I was just wondering if you made that connection in the way you conceptualize it as well. So.
Yeah, and it's interesting. Just one little quick note. I used to think about chaos, but I actually think randomness is better, because chaos actually has a structure. It's unpredictable, but it has a fractal formula behind. Like if you think of math like chaos theory, there is some order to chaos, but that's kind of a nuance and probably not really important to this discussion. But I always find it really interesting, because chaos theory actually kind of applies to my line of work as well. So
yeah,
I generally make that distinction now. I think of order and randomness rather than order and chaos. Anyway.
Yeah, that's helpful. So yeah, I can go through a little bit of my background. I grew up in church, just a kind of evangelical Protestant church, non-denominational, here in the Midwest, and then I spent a little time in Tennessee, in college, and a little bit after that before moving back to here. And just culturally, the Midwest and Tennessee are very different. But I was always involved. I went down there to go to school. It was a Christian school. So I've always kind of been involved in Christian communities, grew up in a Christian home and that kind of thing. And I always was kind of also, just kind of a curious kid, a curious person. And I got tired of the basic, church formula, early on in adulthood, just kind of go and sing a few songs and hear a fairly surface level talk. And I'm like, well, I can play music at home and watch a TED talk, and I don't have to get dressed. So, and I didn't, and, this is kind of one of the things that Paul and I talked about a little bit. I didn't, reject Christianity. I just kind of rejected that kind of church model.
Trappings. Yeah.
And kind of took responsibility myself to say, okay, if this is, as deep as this goes, I need to kind of go learn more and dig around. And so that's what I've kind of done. And then of course, it all kind of seems to, a lot of things happen with Jordan Peterson. So my kind of idea kind of starts with listening to Jordan Peterson, and he didn't necessarily, I was already a Christian, and I, had my beliefs, fairly firmly, but he explained a lot of things, in new ways, and put them in context I hadn't really thought about. And one of the things that he said that just really struck me was the way he defined love as fighting on the side of somebody who's struggling towards the light, which was something that, I always kind of understood, but when he put it in those words, it was kind of like, okay, that, because there's always that sacrifice component. There's that idea of, trying to help somebody better themselves, even when sometimes they don't like the outcome, or even sometimes when you don't like the outcome. And so I just kind of got to thinking about that, because I think that that's a fairly I think that's a pretty good universal definition of what love is. But then I kind of started thinking about, like I used to have a really close friend. He actually passed earlier this year, but he was one of those people that, like, we were close friends in high school and we don't see each other often, but when we did, it was like we kind of picked up right where we left off. And every time I left a conversation with him, we would say, I love you to each other, or we got off the phone, it was, I love you. And I kind of thought about, like, okay, I say I love you to him, and I mean it. I do want to fight on the side of him that's, struggling towards the light and finding the best for himself. But then I also think, like, every time I get off the phone with my wife, I say I love you too. And when I say I love you to my wife versus when I say I love you to my friend, those don't mean the same thing. They both mean at a high level, I will fight on the side of you that's struggling towards the light. But, when I'm talking to my friend, I don't mean, I will procreate with you and give you my name and all of these things. Right. So that's when I started kind of thinking, like, what is the, like, if the kind of universal definition of love is very simple, then why are these things kind of manifested differently? And so that's what I kind of started exploring. And so the easy step is the marriage one, because we have the Christ in the church, and the Bible is pretty clear about explaining that relationship. That's that you don't have to be an expert in symbolism to it spells it out specifically. So that was kind of the first one, and that that understanding even predated Jordan Peterson or any of that. That was actually the wedding vows that I wrote for when me and my wife got married. Hers was all Proverbs 31, this is the perfect wife. And then, well, what's the perfect husband? Oh, well, I guess that's Jesus, because he's the bridegroom of the church. And then, what are the implications of that for my marriage? And so that was pretty easy. And then when you think about the idea of the father, then, okay, so there's a different kind of love. Again, whenever I tuck my kids in at night, I tell them I love you, which again means something different from when I'm talking to my friend or when I'm talking to my wife. So, okay, so there's this other father, parent, child love that exists, that is, we have an element of the Trinity called the Father. We understand that concept, and my house church that I'm a part of, we're actually going through the book of John right now, and we just wrapped up chapter 5, and Jesus gives this whole long speech about the Father and the Son, and it's all about authority and things. So it's, you can see that relationship. So then the one that didn't necessarily come to me right away is like, okay, so you got a parent-child kind of love, you've got a spousal kind of love. These things make sense, and they're different, and they both are, some part of the Trinity, which means that other part probably means something too. And so I had kind of thought, well, that would be the one that applies to my friend. So I guess that's just like, friends or something. And until I had a conversation with my brother and told it to him, and he said, no, that's a sibling. That's somebody that you're there from the beginning, learning how to get along with. And then, once you grow beyond just your siblings, then you extend that to your friends. But the reason that the sibling thing struck me so much was, as I was kind of, trying to sort out what all that love stuff meant and all those relationships, I was kind of on a parallel path around, trying to understand the family and the significance of family. And we can get into some of that, because I think it ties in really well to your structure and flexibility thing. And so when I heard that, that's when all of it kind of clicked and was like, okay, that makes sense, because then the family becomes kind of the fundamental, representation of, like, the image of God. And so, it's not necessarily individual. And this is what Paul and I talked about a little bit. It's like an atom can't, it doesn't break down into further. Electrons aren't just bouncing around in the world. They're bouncing around as part of atoms. And so there are smaller elements, but the elements, those individual, subatomic particles, aren't really anything until they're part of that atom itself. And that's kind of the way I think about the family. And so we have the three elements of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit represented through the way spouses love each other, parents and children love each other, and siblings love each other. And so that family unit, if it's done perfectly, which of course it never is, but that is your, where you kind of get this understanding of God and a representation of God that is reflected out into the world.
Yeah, it's almost like a fractal pattern.
Yeah, exactly. Yep.
So I don't know, just for the audience, a fractal is basically it's a shape that doesn't have a scale. So that means no matter at what scale you look at it, it looks the same. A really, like, the classic example is the coastline of a country. Like, if you look at it, if you look at it where you can see the whole thing on a piece of paper, the scale, the shape of the coast looks the same. If you zoom in 10 times and look at it, it looks the same. If you zoom in again, it looks the same. So it regardless of what scale you're looking at, a fractal, it looks the same. And that's the same idea. A lot of traditional concepts and religious concepts really are fractal patterns that we see on the individual level, family level, body of Christ level, world level, and it's like that same fractal pattern moves in and out. I would offer maybe a fourth expansion of your love to loving your enemies, right? Just from a Christ point of view, it's like if you're, love God, love your wife, love your kids, love your brother, love your family, and then it's like there's that loving your enemies component as well, which I know doesn't fit with the triadic kind of thing you had going on there, which is really nice. It's a nice model, but I was thinking of the four loves from C.S. Lewis kind of model.
Yeah, and Paul had recommended that.
The way that looks to me is, the way that looks to me is, if you take your Trinity, let's say you expand it out to the body of Christ. So the sibling is your brothers and sisters in Christ, right? Mm-hmm. Now you're in a bounded circle because you're in the family of mm-hmm. Christ, the bride of Christ, the family of Christ. You're in a bounded circle. Love your enemy is whatever is outside the boundary. So that means you have to expand your circle in order to love your enemy. So you're not really you're not changing the triadic nature of it. You're just expanding your boundary, right? Mm-hmm. So we know that the only unbounded entity is God. So within our world, we always have to be thinking about what our boundary is. And when you love your enemy, you're just increasing, you're widening your circle. You're letting more into your circle of love, right?
Yeah, I think I think it actually could be simpler than that. I think that your sibling extends out to your neighbor. And I think your neighbor could just as easily be your enemy. And I think your sibling could just as easily be your enemy. I mean, especially if you look at, the Old Testament, Cain and Abel and Jacob and Esau and, Jacob's sons. I mean, there's a lot of sibling, enemies between siblings. And if you were to take, especially if you were to take, Isaac and Ishmael, you've got a sibling. Tribes become enemies, on down through generations. But ultimately they're still siblings. They're still, kind of have the same responsibility to love them the same way you would love your own brother, your neighbor that you do have a good relationship with.
No, you're totally right. Yeah. Yeah. It would be an expansion of that sibling love. Yeah, I agree with that. How has your model helped you with your family, or with your, with the, how has it affected your kind of daily interactions or your viewpoint? How does it affect the way you look at the world?
Well, there's I kind of mentioned there was kind of a parallel thing that was going on in terms of my development of the understanding of the family. And I'll try not to belabor that point, but I think it helps kind of tie this all together, because one of the other things that I had been thinking about, I mean, really at the same time, listening to Jordan Peterson, and I, used to, probably still am, too interested in politics for my own good. But, a lot of that stuff with Jordan Peterson was the Bill C-16 and, compelled speech and all that kind of stuff. And then it got into, kind of this identity politics thing. And so I had been having this thought about identity and how really our identity, like I think part of the reason that we're so fractured as a society is we've told people that your identity is defined by your skin color or your sexual preference or your your gender,
Or that
or
you can
whatever those
declare your
things
you
are.
can
Yeah,
declare your identity in a vacuum.
right. You're right.
It's gotten
Um,
that far where I can declare that I'm an attack helicopter.
right. Yeah, exactly. But so my thing was that I in my mind I kind of traced that back to losing the fact that our identity was tied to our family. So to me, the family, that's where we get our identity. There's the whole, when you think about like a name, as I'm developing these ideas, I'm having conversations with, a coworker friend of mine who does not share any of my beliefs really. And she was, waiting to get engaged to, and then or proposed to, and then got engaged, and then got married over the course of time that we were working together and having conversations. And she had, talked about, she didn't know she was going to change her name when she got married. And she thought that it was very, I don't know, she appreciated that her boyfriend, fiance at the time, kind of gave her that choice. And I just, my natural reaction is that doesn't make any sense, because I grew up in a world where it's just a given that, when a woman gets married, she takes the man's name.
Mm-hmm.
But, like anything else where you just grow up with it and assume it's true, you have to kind of go investigate it for yourself. And especially if you're going to talk to somebody who believes the opposite, you want to know that, it's not just, well, because somebody said so,
Mm-hmm.
and so when, as I'm thinking about that, and of course I'm listening to Jordan Peterson, and there's, the masculine and the feminine, and the different roles that people play. And,
Mm-hmm.
I thought about how, you could kind of think about like, and this is a dumb analogy, but you can kind of think about like in the movie Toy Story, when Andy puts his name on Woody's foot, it's like, he's not saying nobody else can play with Woody. He's saying I'm responsible, and giving my wife my name was not a, me bullying her. It was me saying, now you don't have to rely on your father, who's where you got your name from. Now you can rely on me, and now I'm responsible for. And again, it goes back to that Christ in the church kind of thing. I'm responsible to protect you and to make sure your needs are met, and all of these things.
Yeah.
And so I was thinking through that. And the other thing I think about the name, and I don't know if you had this experience. I think you mentioned you had at least one kid, but
I do, yeah.
when I have 4 daughters, and when the first one was born,
I have 2 stepdaughters and a daughter, so
yeah.
actually,
So you,
mine are 2 of my stepdaughters are grown. They're out of the house, and then I have a 13-year-old. So that's where this comes
young.
from, brother.
Yeah, for sure. Mine are. I got a 6-year-old, twin 5-year-olds, and a 2-year-old. So they're all still pretty little. But so when my first, yeah, but I got a male dog. That's what everybody tells me. You got to have a male dog. So I got that taken care of.
I don't even have that. I have a male cat.
Yeah, that almost counts.
Nope.
But so I remember when my daughter was born, and I remember sitting in the hospital and just waiting for this flood of emotions to happen that I had kind of heard about or been told about, and it didn't happen. I remember I kind of like awkward laughed when I held her for the first time, because I was like, I feel like I should be weeping, and I'm not. And it took about a week, once she got home, and was my responsibility. And I started thinking about that name thing, and it's like, the mother doesn't necessarily need to give her name, to her kids, because they're already, like, she's carried them already. There's a bond that already exists. For me, I didn't have that. And so by putting, my name on it, by saying these are my responsibility, both my wife and all of the kids, it's a way to tie me to it. And there's so much, I look at a lot of the challenges in the world today, and this whole, identity politics thing. And I think, well, how could these people know that their identity is supposed to come from their family if the father's not there? and there's so much, single motherhood and fatherlessness. And it's like, it just feels inevitable, right? There's no, that tie to the person saying, look, I'm going to give you my name, not because I'm taking ownership of you in a negative way. I know, that's easy for people to twist and say, you want to own them and control them, but I'm taking responsibility, that what happens to you is my responsibility. And it's my job to keep my kids safe. It's my job to make sure that everybody's provided for and things are taken care of. And so that was kind of, like I said, a parallel thing that was going on, where I was developing this idea of identity and the family and the importance of the family. So when my brother said, that's a sibling, that to me was like, well, that makes sense, because now you've got this whole group identified as its own unit that represents kind of God as this, Godhead unit, but it's made up of these different parts, and they all kind of play a different role. But they are one, they have the same name. And I know I'm kind of rambling again.
No, go ahead.
But to kind of transition into your structure and flexibility thing, because I've been thinking about that a lot since I watched your all's conversation. And I was thinking about the name thing. This actually just hit me earlier today. The name thing, it's almost like the last name is the structure and the first name is the flexibility, or the last name is the order and the first name is the chaos, or the randomness.
Yeah, the randomness.
Because that's your pillar, that's your tree, that's your last name comes from that. You all share it. It's a part of this whole system. And then who you are as an individual, you're still an individual. You still confront the world and have your own problems, and you have to move off and have your own family then that has, that's like a fractal again, starts its own thing.
Right.
But even that then still ties back, right? And that name carries through all the way through. And so then you have certain responsibilities to that and everything else. So anyway, I'll kind of stop and see if that makes sense to you.
Totally makes sense. I was just going to say it ties into a couple of things kind of come to mind. One is it ties into the fact that essentially we're all God's children and we're made in the image of God. And that's our true personhood, right? And that confusion around personhood is what's leading to so much of the craziness that's going on around us, right? If we forget who God is, and then we forget that we are made in the image of God, then I can declare myself an attack helicopter. And it's logical, because there is no basis to reality without God and being created in the image of God. That was one thing that I was thinking of. And then the other thing I was thinking of was the idea in Orthodoxy, they basically teach that all of the heresies come from either misunderstanding the names of God or misunderstanding the person of God. And by not understanding the nature of God, and his names are an essential part of his nature, it's as close as we can get to naming God. You can't name the unnameable, but the names of God, that's the first thing that Adam did in the Garden of Eden. God creates the world, puts all the plants, animals, and water, everything's in place, everything's running, garden's built. Adam goes in. Adam's first job is to name something, which a name is really interesting because it separates and unifies at the same time, right? It demarks something and separates it from everything else and says it's this, but at the same time it unifies it because it identifies everything else that has those same properties as one, so it unifies and separates at the same time. So, I think your instincts, you're following your instincts into some really interesting philosophical and spiritual frameworks that really help make sense of the world. It really helps to see how things work and to see why names are important and that they do have meaning and that it's not arbitrary, and taking on your husband's name is not arbitrary. It's not the problem we're seeing right now in modern society is that so many of them associate masculinity with toxicity or with tyranny. Mm-hmm. But what's ironic is, like you said, they don't have that. They didn't have an experience of a father in their lives. And if they did, it may have been traumatic, and it leads them to rejecting the tyrannical father, but then the state becomes their father, and they want to give more and more power to the state to rule over them.
Yeah.
Because they feel unsafe. They don't feel comfortable. Their father was not in there to encourage them, which is like a father's main role in a child's life, is to encourage them to confront Jordan Peterson's dragon, to go out into the world. And the father's not there, so they feel everything is a threat. They feel anxious, they feel upset, and they want to give the state more and more power over them to rule them. C.S. Lewis talks about this. C.S. Lewis was onto this 100 years ago, or I guess I should say like 60 years ago. But I don't know how much reading you've done with C.S. Lewis, but he really lays out the danger in losing sight of the importance of the traditional family structure, and the roles that having a father and a mother in your life plays, and how important that role is. So.
Yeah, and I unfortunately I haven't really. Everybody is constantly telling me to read C.S. Lewis, but for whatever reason I just have never. I read the Screw Tape Letters. It's the only one that I've.
There's a really great channel on YouTube that's called the C.S. Doodles.
Yeah, I have seen several of those. People send
okay.
them.
Yeah. Okay, so that's where I pick up most of my C.S. Lewis.
Yeah.
Well, if you want a really fast read, just read The Great Divorce.
Yeah.
Very short.
And that's the one that I assume has, probably reflects a lot of what I'm saying in terms of, because, that's one of the things.
It doesn't have anything to do with divorce.
Really? I mean, I assume it doesn't literally. I figured it was a representation of the same idea.
No, The Great Divorce is about the divorce between heaven and hell.
Okay, gotcha.
Well, maybe not between heaven and hell, but between a certain mindset that makes a person want to be in heaven and a mindset that makes a person want to be in hell.
Sure.
And the reason I like that as a good place to start with C.S. Lewis is that the way he draws the characters is so perfect. I can see part of myself in every single one of the characters. And it just reminds me every time I read it, don't let yourself go down that road. There's another road. Don't go down that road.
Yeah.
Because that road does not have a good end. None of those roads have a good end.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a good one to read every few years just to keep you honest.
Yeah. Yeah. So a couple other things, Jeremy, that kind of I was reminded of while you were talking. One was, even before, again, going back to probably around the same time that when I got married and was thinking about, Christ and the church, I had, my pastor at the time gave me a book from Francis Chan called Crazy Love. And there's a part in there where he talks about how he struggled with the idea of God as father because of his relationship with his father. And that was new to me at the time. I mean, that was probably 10 years ago now. But at the time I had never considered that. And so that, that kind of plays into this idea too, that when I think about the family, and I was I think it was yesterday, I was just listening to your conversation that you had with Paul, and you made a comparison to like trying to learn karate from reading a book.
Yes.
And there's, it's not the same as being there and physically doing it and experiencing it and, doing the moves or receiving the blows or all that stuff that goes with it. And I was kind of thinking about that in terms of, the family is also a way that I think we end up seeing God, whether we like it or not. That when we are taught about God as the Father, our minds immediately think of our Father. And when we, when we think about loving other people, the way we learn and develop those skills is this shared living space with our siblings and the people who are our peers that don't have authority over us, but still we have some responsibility to them and to that relationship. And I mentioned in my conversation with Paul that when I was a kid and my grandma used to babysit us and we wanted to have friends over, like in the summertime, she would always, if we weren't getting along, me and my siblings, we couldn't have friends over. And she would always say to us, if you can't get along with your own brother, how can you get along with, a friend or somebody else? And to me, That's a lot of the way I think about it. And I think the same is kind of true. I've personally seen people who have gone through like a divorce or, infidelity in their marriage, and they reject God or the church or something, and they lose the concept of what marriage is, and that breaks the concept of, kind of Christ and the church. And so the whole experience of, being a part of a family, being born into a family or not, whether, maybe you're orphaned or, maybe you are fatherless or something, you, as those elements are removed from what the family unit is supposed to be, it's stripping away kind of your ability to see God clearly. It's adding additional hurdles. And that's, you asked me how this affects, kind of the way I see family or operate in my own family. That's one of the biggest, things that I kind of, it's a burden, but not in a bad way. But to me, it's that weight is on my shoulders. Like when my kids grow up, and as they're growing up and they hear about this Father God, and their mind is going to think of me and what representation, what kind of representative am I of that idea, and am I reflecting that to them? And you mentioned the role of the father is encourager, but also teaching kids discipline. And I purposely word it that way because I feel like people say that they discipline their kids. I don't want to discipline my kids. I want my kids to learn how to discipline themselves, because eventually they're not going to be under me anymore. They're not going to live here, and they have to be disciplined. So I see my job more as teaching them to be disciplined. But I think that's part of the way we interact with God too. We're developing ourselves so that we can interact more appropriately with the world. God's not, a tyrannical father like you were saying. He is encouraging us, but also he does that through discipline and helping us learn how to develop discipline in our lives so that we can love our neighbor and we can be a better, brother or a better husband or a better father. And so that's another kind of element of it, how it all kind of fits together for me too.
Yeah, no, that's well said. It's good to hear that you're taking that role seriously and trying to instill, that self-reliance in your kids, right? Because you won't always be there. I always say that being a parent is the longest, slowest, most painful breakup you'll ever go through in your life, because it's the most beautiful breakup you'll ever go through. But your whole job is to make yourself obsolete as a parent, right? And you never really become obsolete. I mean, I just lost my father about a month ago, and he still has a role in my life. He still plays a role in my mind and in my heart, in how I make decisions. But on the other hand, when it comes to day to day, I run my life and my family's life as much as I can. I try to lead and by example and be a support and a help. And it's from his example, he was 19 when I was born, and my mom they were married for 10 years and my mom never worked. He just went and took care of his family, and supported us. And it's sad that so many people don't have the experience of having a father in their life. It's a tragedy, and I think it leads to a lot of what we're seeing in the general culture and general energy of our time. The anxiousness and the vacillating drastically so rapidly, and really just living unprincipled, emotional for the moment. Whatever occurs to our emotions in the moment is what we think is right. And I think a lot of that comes from fatherless homes,
Totally agree.
Because our parents, your dad teaches you emotional regulation. Jordan Peterson talks about this a lot, with the rough and tumble play. You get your kids riled up and then you calm them down before bed. You come home, you wrestle with them, and then you say, okay, that's enough. And then everybody calms down, and that's what dads do. And so many people didn't get that dad to do that. They didn't have their dad to encourage them. They didn't have their dad to teach them discipline and to teach them how to follow, a leader. And now you just get people who are lost and aimless and anxious. And
Yeah.
it's a disease. It's very widespread and dangerous. We're seeing it getting more. People are getting more and more anxious and more desperate.
Yep. Yeah, I totally agree with that analysis. I reminded me of another thing. I know I've just got a bunch of stories, but when I was in high school, I played sports, and there was a phrase, I think it was from a movie that had recently come out, that was quoted, all the time, was like, the name on the front of your jersey is more important than the name on the back, which I understood the underlying meaning of, like, it's about the team and not about the individual. But I remember thinking, like, that's really stupid, because the standard that I'm held to by the name on the back is way higher than the standard I'm held to by the name on the front. Like if I go do something stupid in a football game, like, the embarrassment, not only my dad, but I had two brothers on the football team with me at the same time. Like
Right.
that name carried a lot more weight. But to me, it was because that, it wasn't my first name. If it was my first name, then I think I the saying makes more sense to me. But because it was my last name, it was like I have an even higher responsibility to that, and it's a kind of a semantic thing. I know it's kind of silly, but I remember having that thought, like, even back then, that, like, the standard, if the conversation is about, your standard of behavior or your contribution to this effort, like, I already know the contribution to any effort that I'm a part of comes with a certain standard, because that's what was instilled in me by the name on the back, and not just from my father, but his father, and there's, and the whole idea that I carry this name around is me carrying that responsibility into the world. And when I go back to thinking about, like, the first name is the, randomness and chaos, and the second name is the structure or the order, or the last name, I should say. I mean, it really does, I do kind of approach the world that way. And I think that that's part of the way the family is supposed to work, that you raise your kids so that when they go into the world and when they're in school, and the opinions that teachers have of them or whatever, that, as a person who, I was the middle child, so I only had one, I'm one of four, but I only had one above me. But he wasn't necessarily the most well-behaved in school. So by the time I got to a lot of teachers' classes, it was like, oh, you're that kid's brother, like, they just assumed that I was going to be a terrible kid too, which I generally wasn't. But that's kind of stuff that I think about, like, when my girls go through school and they're all really close and all close together in age, and people talk about, those girls, and they'll identify them all as a group because of their name, like, that's a reflection of me as a father,
Yes.
And that's, I know I'm kind of repeating the general point of that's the responsibility that I have, but I think that's part of, kind of to your point about how that's missing in the world. People just don't think that they don't have that responsibility. And part of it is because their parents aren't, conscious of that and raising them with that in the back of their mind. Because a lot of parents, if they did, would think, would enforce things differently. It's like Jordan Peterson's, don't let your kid do anything that makes you not like them, right? I mean, it's like, if you don't like them, somebody else doesn't like them, and that's your name that those people don't like,
Right. Well, and not only that, but they're not going to help your kid.
Right.
If you don't like them, they're really not going to like them. They're not going to help your kid. And it takes more than you to raise your kid.
Right.
So I'm sorry, Karen, I didn't mean to.
Oh, no, that's okay. I was just going to say, going back to your story about the team name, I thought that was really interesting. So if we were going to fractal that up a little bit, you think the team name would relate to, like, our denomination, but the name on the back would be that we are all children of God?
I don't know. So for me, it's hard to think in terms of denominations. The group that I meet with doesn't really.
Where does the team name come in, though? Like, so if I'm thinking that the most important name that I am carrying is the Lord's name, right?
Right.
That's the name on my back.
Hmm.
That's the one that I'm most responsible to, for his reputation and all of that.
Right.
What's the name on the front that people think is the important one, but isn't really the important one?
Well, I think you could put a lot of things there. I think, you know, a lot of those identities we talked about, American or anything. I think that's anything you could use to divide people, right? Because the team, when I played sports, my team had an
There you
identifier
go.
because
Yeah.
the team I had an opponent, right? There was always somebody else. There was never just one team. So anything that could separate us to create competition, I think you could put in the play, whether that's denomination or a country or, with my high school, it was just our town versus the next town over, that kind of stuff. But yeah, when you fractal that up, I think that applies to any way that we kind of divide ourselves into tribes and attempt
Yeah.
to eat.
Yeah. So does that bring up anything for you, Jeremy?
No, I just I kind of see it a little differently. I see that kind of as an inversion. I think it explains why Brad, you're not a communist, because you identified more with your family than with the team.
Yeah. Oh yeah, for sure.
And the whole idea of being communist is identifying more with the group than with your identity, with your individual identity.
Yeah.
I was going to say, the way I see it is the team on the front that I'm playing for is Jesus, and the one on my back is my family, or the one on my back is my like you were saying, the group name, the smaller. But it doesn't matter, the concept, the way you explained it, because you had an inverted hierarchy there, where your family identity was more important to you than the team identity. That totally makes sense to transplant that to what Karen is saying, with Jesus being the most important identity. I was just thinking of the classic structure that they were trying to teach you, is that
Right.
your team identity is more important than your family identity. But for you, that wasn't the case. For you, there was more legacy, more pride, more and more shame, frankly, of if you messed it up, that would go along with making mistakes under the family name than there would be under the team name.
Right. And if
your brothers and your dad held you to a higher standard than your coach did.
yeah, and if I lived up
Hierarchy
to
is a little inverted for you.
yeah, if I lived up to the name on the back, I would inherently be living up to the name on the front. But if
Yeah,
I lived up to the name on the front, there was no guarantee I was living up to the name on the back.
right. The expectations were much higher at home than they were at school. Yeah,
right.
that makes sense.
But to your point about why I'm not a communist, I think I think that there are probably people. I'm not a big conspiracy theorist, or I don't think people are as wise to what they're doing all the time.
Right.
Or maybe it is some conspiracy, if you want to say that it's kind of Satan's conspiracy, like a screw tape letters kind of idea, that that the acceptance of single motherhood in society today, and even the encouragement of it, the celebration of it, in a lot of cases, certainly does contribute to that. When I was talking before about this, how identity politics takes over, I think that's how it happens. You first break up the family, you no longer identify with your family, and now you identify with whatever some politician is promising you. Hey, Joe Biden just said it a couple of weeks ago. If you don't vote for me, you ain't black, right? You should identify yourself based on this aspect of your identity, not your name, not your family, not your community, not nothing local to you. Just look at the color of your skin, make a decision about what that means you should believe, assume everybody with that same skin color believes the same thing, and then now we've separated you from the actual family unit, created a false family, and then we'll make ourselves the father. And we'll do the same thing with anybody who, let's convince people that if they're attracted to the same sex, that's an identity. And let's say they're all, one team, and let's convince them that everybody thinks the same thing. And then we'll be the father of that family. Now they'll all, it's not even a secret. I mean, the whole coalition building concept of politics, I mean, that goes back I mean, at least what Jesse Jackson was doing it with the Rainbow Coalition. That's even before I was born, so I don't go back much further than that. But I'm
it goes way back before that. But yeah, no, you're dead on right, and it's the idea that this is something I kind of stumbled into just a few days ago. So the group identity becomes more important than the individual, right? So the group identity is the main identifier for an individual, right? And so what happens is when you get into that mentality, you start identifying with the group. And here's the problem with it. Well, one of the major problems with it is that there's also no forgiveness, right? You see all of these acts of purity. People are kneeling, people are putting on masks, people are surrendering. These are all acts of purity, right? They're trying to out purity each other. They're trying to show how pure they are and how they belong in the group, and they can say what is supposed to be said, right? And we're in unity. The problem is if you make a mistake or if you say something that's off script, then they come after you to show how they're still in the group. They attack you. And if you apologize, what you've done is you've confessed sin to the group. Right. But in their ideology, there's no mechanism, because there's no authority, there's no mechanism to be absolved, to be forgiven, and to be retaken into the group. So you're banished. That's what cancel culture is, right? Well, if you're banished, you no longer have the group to support you. And that was your family structure, and you've been banished into the wilderness on your own.
Yeah.
That's the fear of death. And that fear of being kicked out of the group into wilderness is what quiets the storm of cognitive dissonance that's going on in the mind of every leftist.
Yeah. Well, and it reminds me of the idea of like gangs and the way they develop in, poorer neighborhoods, where it's like, at least I can get some protection. At least I can have, some identity with this. That becomes my family, and that becomes my identity. And I wear something that signifies that, not only does this make me, part of the group, but it means if you mess with me, you're messing with that group. And so that becomes my identity instead of my family. And that's why you see in communities where fatherlessness is a bigger issue, that those are where gangs and things are more likely to pop up.
And what do you have to do to join a gang? You either have to prove your bravery, or you have to be humiliated, and usually both.
Right.
You have to prove that you're brave by doing something stupid, and you have to be humiliated, which is what we're seeing all around us. We're seeing people who are being brought into a gang through a humiliation rites, right? Yeah. It's just, and they're subsuming their identity and their individuality to the group.
Well, and I think, it also, it's, and we've already kind of said this, but it's not just fatherlessness, it's a father that doesn't fill their role appropriately or effectively, right? And so when you talk about how, there's no forgiveness, there's no absolvance of those sins, well, you have to model that in your home with your kids as well. That's another part of being a parent, is like, your kids have to understand grace, they have to understand forgiveness, or they can't understand grace or forgiveness of the Father, or they're going to go to a group where they, feel like they can do whatever they want. But then at the same time,
tyranny to them. You'll be modeling tyranny.
Exactly right.
They'll rebel, right?
Yep,
that's
exactly.
What people do.
If you go the other side and there's no structure, then you're just modeling chaos essentially. And
correct.
They go find something, and that's people join cults for a reason. They look for a structure that they didn't have.
Right.
Another thing that I was going to bring up though too, and it all goes along with this, is I've listened to Paul's done a couple videos now on homosexuality himself, and he had the conversation with Preston Sprinkle that he posted last week, and he always starts from that question of what is marriage? Don't talk to me about what you feel about gay marriage or anything else until you can define what marriage is. And so to me, this is what I go back to. So when I'm having that conversation or I'm wrestling with that idea of what is marriage, I go back to, well, what is the base unit for this structure, this atomic structure? What you can only produce kids, and so you can only have the parent-child relationship, and the siblings can only have relationships if you have the right relationship between the parents, And so the second you start saying, well, that's not necessary, you're saying, well, then the whole structure just falls apart.
Right.
And that whole reflection of God then is I would say not just useless, but degraded by that.
Yes.
And you're kind of spitting in the face of God when you do that. So it's not so much you can't be gay because there's a verse in Leviticus that says something. There is a structure that exists that underlies everything that we do. Your very presence on the world only is possible because a man and a woman came together, and the fractal that you should be continuing requires that same thing. And I think that part of the challenge that we get into is the idea that we're supposed to marry based on attraction, or it's all about attraction, and that's one of the ways that I have been frustrated with, like, the evangelical churches that I grew up in. It was always like, find the right woman, save yourself for marriage, but if you find the right woman, it's all going to be great. And it's like, okay, but what happens if I wake up and I don't look attractive to her, or she doesn't look attractive to me, or like, love has to be bigger than that. Love has to be deeper than that. It has to have another element to it besides just how I feel, or being driven by my emotions, or some concept of attraction. And there's a responsibility there. And that's why marriages for hundreds of years, thousands of years, could exist, even though the people who are married didn't even know each other beforehand. Like, the only reason that happens is because they understand what they're committing to as a responsibility, and not just a right, or not just something for them to enjoy, but something for them to find meaning in.
And it wasn't primarily emotional driven. It was
right.
It was driven out of survivability and a loyalty to their ancestors, right?
Yep.
I mean, it was like you're continuing a line, and there was much more respect for that, and yeah, the whole concept of marrying for romantic love is that's a product of the French Revolution. That's where that idea very first kind of was born. Was out of liberty, and I can do what I want to do. And the French Revolution really was the root of a lot of the chaos that we see around us today.
Right. But that's what I was going to say. It's kind of the beginning and the end. I mean, that was, once you start taking that aspect out of, marriage, especially, you're just beginning the dismantling of the family in the society, which, you think about it as a fractal. You dismantle the family, you dismantle the society. And that's exactly what we're kind of in the midst of, it feels like.
Yeah, for sure.
I remember fairly early in my own marriage, we were having quite a few difficulties because we were both, this is a second marriage for me, because my first husband, after 19 years, told me that he was gay and left me. So this is a second marriage for me. And so both myself and my husband now were a little bit older when we first got married. So we kind of set in our ways. And so we had some struggles in the early years. And I remember we were having this discussion one time, and my husband said to me, well, how do I know if you're the right person? Maybe I made a mistake in marrying you. And I thought about it for a minute, and I thought, if you're married, that's the right person.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? That's it. I mean, they may not have been the right person when you married them, but if you're married, they are now the right person. I mean, barring abuse or something like that.
Sure.
Because God is capable of changing each one of the partners in a way that will make that marriage something beautiful. And he does. And you can go through difficulties, you can go through really bad times together and come out the other side into beauty again. And you can go through another bad time and come out, and it's possible. And my husband and I have ridden that wave for probably the first 15 years. We really had a lot of struggles. But now we've been married for 28 years, maybe. The last 5 or 10 years have just been getting better all the time. And I'm so thankful we stuck together, because, there are a lot of times when marriage gets hard, it's really hard. There is nothing as hard as being in relationship with someone where you're joined at the hip and you can't communicate.
Yeah.
But when you make it through that and you get to the other side, you have something that is so worthwhile, right? And I really feel bad for people that give up so early on in their marriages. You know,
Yeah, I totally
they're walking away from all their memories. They're walking away from all the opportunities to grow and change and develop that are there in marriage.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, it's
Well,
it's inherently, a selfish thing. It's inherently, sacrificing what could be there, for the sake of what you think is better for you right now.
mm,
And that to me is, you know anything. I tend to think of selfishness and sin as pretty much synonymous. That, sin is just you supplanting God in your life and doing what feels right to you. And anytime somebody, you know takes that, takes their own opinion or their own feelings, as a way to make major decisions in their life, I mean, that always saddens me. I mean, I think that's a sad situation. And again, it goes back to the parents. And, maybe it's just because my kids are still young and I still feel that burden. But so much of, the outcomes of people's lives to me goes back to what was the structure, how were their parents, and just see that reflected, in the next 60 years after they leave the house.
I I agree with you, but I will say your kids are going to shock you with how different they are and
Yeah.
how unexpected their lives end up being.
Oh, I'm sure.
They're
Yeah.
going to shock you with all kinds of really fun revelations on who they really are, and how little you played in their, how little of a role you played in their life.
Right.
No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding. They, no, you'll obviously have you're already really on a good track. It sounds like you're doing really well in leading your daughters down a good path, but they will surprise you with how unique they are, how beautiful their personalities are, and how they develop and blossom in such unpredictable ways. It's really, really a beautiful thing to be able to be a part of as a parent, and I'm on my last one at home. I've got a 13-year-old daughter, and it's just every day I love it. I love being able to watch her develop her own personality, and she has certain really strong opinions, and it's fun to kind of throw little pins at those and say, well, what about this? And then you get, and then everything just goes like, ooh, and you can see this process happening. It's just a beautiful, beautiful thing. And I'm grateful that your daughters have you in their life. It's a, like I said, it's becoming rarer and rarer in our culture. Apparently, people who have a father at home are still the majority, but even in those homes, there's still a lot of trauma and a lot of pain that's passed on, and I'm guilty of that, passing some of the trauma on from my childhood, and I'm just trying to unwire that now and trying to undo that.
Yeah.
And it's
I think we all are. I mean, I think about, the idea of, like, the sins of the father being passed down, and it's like, um, it's inevitable. Your parents aren't perfect representations of what, a perfect marriage or perfect parenting is. And so, like I said before, the way we see God is affected by that. And so we can't have a perfect concept of God if we didn't have a perfect family experience, which none of us do. So then we grow up and we reflect those flaws, and then our kids also reflect those flaws. And so my wife and I actually had a conversation about this just the other day, just with some of the things we've seen posted from some of our friends and family members about some of the stuff that's going on right now. And just like, I err much more on the side of the burden it is to raise them than I do on the side of, they're going to turn out how they turn out, and it is what it is, kind of thing, which,
both are true. Both are true. You
yeah,
have
yeah,
a responsibility, and they have personality.
right.
Yes,
Yeah.
and the other thing is you can control how you act as a father, and the standards that you want to uphold, and your own um, your own struggles and your own commitment to living a godly life in front of your kids and all of those things. But you absolutely cannot control how they interpret what is happening in their lives, because they might even think right now everything is lovely, and yet when they get older and start having some problems and start going to a counselor and they remember back something in their life, they may be reinterpreting it through a new lens at that point, and you just don't have any control over that. But God is in control regardless of what happens, you know. So if you're laying down good tracks in their lives and you're showing them a life of love and commitment, they may go through some hard times when they're dealing with that stuff, when they're watching the movie on the wrong screen, you know. But eventually, I really believe that they will come back and align themselves again with the truth that they learned when they were at home.
Yeah. Yeah. I tend to think that, you know, and maybe it's stupid of me, but I tend to think that, like, if I could be the perfect parent and my wife could be the perfect parent, then maybe our kids could be perfect. But I know that that's not reality. And so that's where I kind of get that idea of, like, my flaws will reflect in my parenting of them and then reflect in them in some way or another. You know, and, you know, personality aside, their ability to make good decisions will, their lack of ability to make good decisions will be in some sense a consequence of my lack of ability to make good decisions. Because we're all flawed, you know what I mean? And humanity does that too. I mean, you can kind of almost think of a fractal through generations, right? We tend to create the same patterns, and see the same mistakes happen in families. And I think a lot of that has to do with, you know, we aren't perfect. And if we're the ones setting the initial standard for our kids, then it's impossible for them to be perfect. But then it's also a reminder to show myself grace, show my wife grace, show my kids grace, to understand that perfection isn't the goal. Improvement and, you know, being what's what I'm looking for? You know, moving closer to God is the goal. And so, I mean, I'm not a perfectionist. I don't beat myself up over it, but I do think that there are relationships in the way, you know, our flaws create a gap that then we pass down a gap in terms of our understanding and relationship to God.
Well, and the fortunate thing is you have your wife who's from a different line.
Yep.
Genetically and spiritually. You know, I mean, maybe not spiritually, but like psychologically.
Right.
She's got a different history than you, and she's bringing a different tool set, and she's a woman. She's bringing a different tool set to the mix. And your daughters will have that same influence, right? They're growing up in a different environment, different time, different culture, and they'll marry someone, God willing, and that remixture takes place too, which is also a beautiful part of the plan. I think that's part of the redemption process that goes on in our family lines, is that it's not just you handing down the sins of you, it's also there's a redemptive act of remixing every generation. You know, we're trying different attempts at surviving.
Right.
And
yeah.
so a lot of healing can come from that, right? You know, I mean, my wife and I come from very different backgrounds, and, you know, I'm a man, she's a woman. And so we bring, you know, a certain mix to raising our children. And they're going to have a very different mix because of who they marry, you know, and that's a factor that you don't control. You know, they're probably going to marry someone a lot like you, for better or for worse. And,
Right.
and that's the best you can do, is try to be the kind of man you want your daughters to marry.
Yep.
And that's the best thing you can hold yourself to. Because, yeah, you're right. You're going to make mistakes, and you're going to hurt them in ways that you don't even know you're hurting them, because you're a man and they're girls.
Yep.
I've learned that as a father of daughters, that raising daughters is, they're just wired differently, and it's just the way it is. And you're going to hurt them completely unknowingly, even, you know, especially not even unwilling. You know, you're not meaning to, not intentionally, but then also just not even knowing, your wife will come to you a week later and say, hey, that conversation you had really, that really hurt her feelings, and
Yeah.
your daughter was doing a great job of like stone facing her way through it, but you did some damage, and that is just part of the game, man. You gotta move forward and do the best you can and say you're sorry and give them a hug and take them out for ice cream,
Yep. Yeah, no, obviously it's easy to say, what's coming when you have no idea what's coming, but, I fully expect it's going to be a wild ride.
Once puberty kicks in, everything changes. You'll
Right.
have parenting all figured out until you get your first 13-year-old and you're like, oh shit.
Well, and that's the thing, kind of going back to the structure and flexibility, or the chaos and order, like the if the family is the structure and the individuals are the flexibility piece.
Yes.
Yeah. When you were talking about how you liked randomness better than chaos, because chaos does have at least some element of order, I was kind of thinking, like, in a way that is almost better, in my model, because the chaos is kind of like the kids, like, I can't control all of it, but there is some order to it, and it's tied back to the family structure,
Yes.
So it's not completely random. There is an impact. It's tethered to something that limits how random it can be,
Yes, that's a great point. Yeah, no, you're right.
Yeah.
That's a great point. Yeah, because you have had some influence on your kids up to that point, and there is some mechanism physiologically that keeps it within a certain, you were talking about Six Sigma. Yeah, you've got a control range there, right, that you've created, and that's part of just being human, but yeah, you make a good point that order and chaos is a good way of looking at it when it comes to people, because it's not, people are not random. They are more chaotic than random, for sure. I would agree with that.
Yeah. I don't know if you ever watched the TV show Numbers. I've watched it through a few times. It's basically a guy that solves crimes by doing math. And it'll really mess with your head, in terms of like because he's very, nothing's random. Everything has some, people aren't random, and he does math equations to show how people interact within a crowd, or how a stream of bank robberies are not just isolated. There's a pattern, and I think sometimes he makes us think that the patterns are more easy to identify than they really are.
Yes.
If you watch that show a lot, you're just like, oh, everything is just a pattern, but it's not. It's not that simple. And maybe he's like a super smart, graduated college at 15 or something, who can solve all this stuff.
Well, the writer who wrote the story knew how it was going to end. So
exactly right, exactly. But like, yeah, if you're that kind of person, maybe you can understand the pattern to that degree, but it's really not as ordered as that perception would have you think.
Right. Yeah. No, I agree with that. I've done enough analysis on running a fab shop to know that there are certain ranges, but what happens when you start getting variability at every level and you start adding up those variabilities, everything gets really flat when it comes to predictability, right? So it just becomes very difficult to predict things because you have variables at every level. And that's where I get into, like, in science, the idea of reducibility. That's what blew my mind away from, like, honestly, studying chaos theory and studying the fab shop is what broke me out of atheism, because scientism and materialism was all about reducibility, right? So if I want to understand, if I want to understand physics, if I just get down to the atom level and understand how atoms work, then I can expand that out and I'm going to have a theory of everything. Well, the problem is the smaller we get, the less it expands out. It doesn't expand out well. And in chaos theory, what happens is we get to a point. So if I look at the output of a whole shop, it has a certain wave pattern to it that is unpredictable, but within a certain range. If I look at the output of one department, it has that same scale and that same waviness to it, where it's unpredictable within a certain range. If I look at the output of one production line, it has that same variability. And if I look at the output of one person, it has that same variability. Now, and here's the other challenging part, is that if I give it to person A, it's going to take 2 days. And if I give it to person B, it's going to take 6 days, because you have the Pareto distribution of productivity that correlates with IQ, but I'm not allowed to talk about that because that's really controversial. But there's a Pareto distribution of productivity, and that contributes to the unpredictability and the variability as well, right? To the variance. So if I'm a planner and I'm trying to plan how long a job's going to take, well, if I give it to person A, it's going to take 2 days. Person B is going to take 6 days. And if person B doesn't have what they need, they just stop. And if person A doesn't have what they need, they go get it. You can't predict any of that stuff, right? I mean, there's just so many layers. And this, like, understanding this and starting to study this and starting to try to build a model that would be able to predict things in this environment is what led me to the idea of irreducibility, right? So just because I can go down and look at the behavior or the output or the productivity of one person, well, it doesn't just magically get flatlined and consistent and uniform just because I've gone down to the lowest level. Like, the lowest level of output is a person in my environment, right? Well, that person has good days and bad days. That person is hungry and tired, and sometimes that person is really in a good mood. That person, happens to produce more on Wednesdays than they do on Tuesdays consistently. All of those curves, all of those models roll into trying to predict something. And science is all about prediction. That's what the art of science is, right? Well, when you're in an environment where if you get down to the lowest level of a model and that lowest level has variance, you've got chaos. You've got an unpredictable system. It's predictable within a certain range, but the further you project out, the wider that range is.
Yeah.
And that's just the nature of complex systems. That's why I don't buy into climate change science. I think it's just insane, because I understand enough about chaotic systems and complex systems to say, one, we don't know all the variables. Two, we don't know how those variables are going to change. And three, we don't know the relationships between those variables enough to predict what's going to happen 10,000 years from now, when the best models in the world running on the most expensive computers in the world are only giving me 10 days of weather at better than random. Right. So now I'm going to model that out to 10,000 years. It's no better than random. You can't, there's no way around that.
Yeah. Well, and that
has nothing to do with politics. That has everything to do with math and understanding that there's too much variance. And when you add up all the variance, you don't know how it's going to come out in a model. So then they run the model and they give you percentages, and that's how they predict the weather.
Yeah. Well, and that's one of the things that, in talking to people about, like, the whole coronavirus thing and all the modeling and stuff, to me, it was not so much, I haven't spent as much time on the in-depth science side of it. I actually spend more of my time thinking about the human influence on those things, and the idea of, well, we know there were this many deaths and these many people were infected, and it's like, yeah, but who's collecting that data? You're talking about a disparate group of, every nurse has a different way of charting things and putting things in, and we know that there are different incentives for hospitals to say it was COVID versus not, and it's like, even like, I can appreciate the stress or the fear around not wanting to get sick or anything else, but I don't have a lot of faith in the data itself, because I know how hard it is to get people to collect data. That's what I do all day is, I work with Salesforce. I don't know if you're familiar with what Salesforce is. Yeah. So trying to get salespeople to capture the things that they do in the day and give good information. And so I'm like owning that system and trying to make sure that, when we say, give us this information, we give you, a pick list or an easy way for us to collect it from you, so that it's not so it's consistent, and then I can extrapolate and draw conclusions from that, and aggregate it certain ways, and I know how hard it is for just a sales team of 50 people to fill one field out consistently the same way. You're telling me every nurse in the whole world all of a sudden started capturing information the exact same way everywhere, and it worked out exactly.
Did you ever look into the model of the projections, like where the 2 million deaths in America projections came from? It was all a crappy model that was not built well and didn't produce the same results every time you ran it with the same random seed. It was and it had bugs, and you didn't know if the output was a bug or if it was part of the model, and it was garbage, and no one analyzed it before they made the decisions. You know, they made all the decisions, and then the model come out, and they don't talk about it in the media. They don't, you know, people don't understand it. They don't comprehend concepts, you know, and they're really hesitant. They put so much work into making people trust science and scientists that now if you say, oh, this guy wrote this model and it was a piece of crap, now you're undermining that narrative. So we can't do that, right? So we have to trust the science. Well, the guy who did the science was a really crappy scientist, and he did not submit it for peer review, and it wasn't a robust model. You know, it was just garbage, and he kept it under wraps for 60 days because he was so embarrassed by it.
Yeah, and to kind of tie that back, you know, we kind of got off on this tangent. You brought up Six Sigma, and
no, I'm sorry.
No, you're good, because I think that just kind of going back to that point in the conversation, though, that was one of the things I mentioned when I was talking to Paul too, that I didn't really go in depth on, but you've kind of explained it pretty thoroughly as well. But that, you know, a lot of that concept of leadership and managing an organization is to try to make improvements at the lowest level possible. And then trust that if you're improving the actual output of your, you know, the people on your manufacturing line, or your sales reps, or your people that are actually doing, you know, your marketing or whatever, that it's not about having great managers that can sell really well or that were really good at the thing. It's about getting them to be the best, getting the individuals actually doing the thing to be the best at doing it. And so to me, that's a lot of how, you know, I think that's how Jesus led. I think he was telling his disciples, I'm going to make you better, not, you know, and then I'm going to leave, and you're going to have to be responsible for this. So I'm going to, you know, show you the way. And that's how, you know, you get an organization to be successful. A lot of people think about, like, you know, just having the best guy at the top of the pyramid, but it's really having the best people at kind of the second layer from the bottom that are getting the best output from those people. And then that adds, like you said, you know, there's that fractal that if your bottom is improving, then the whole thing, you know, it's like that rising tide raises all ships kind of thing. And I think that goes back to that idea of, you know, communism or you know, having the government be in charge of things. Is it comes from that same flawed idea that if it's about making the best decisions from the top instead of improving the people at the bottom, executing day to day, you know, in the society, in the marketplace, in the economy, and these things. And the way, you know, what is that biggest impact on those people being the best they can be? Well, it's their parents, right? It's the family. And it goes back to that idea that it's true in organizations, it's true in families. And I think, you know, and that's partly why I, you know, haven't really been associated with a denomination in a long time, because I, you know, and I'm not super familiar with a lot of denominations outside of kind of pretty traditional Protestant, evangelical, Western things. But but that was always kind of my pushback against, you know, that kind of structure was, you know, push the responsibility down, not up, and let the people on the front line grow, and we'll all grow because of it. And
well, that's why capitalism works, right? So the basic problem of capitalism is, how much is this thing worth? How much is this thing that I want to sell worth? Mm-hmm. And the capitalism, they have crowdsourced that problem down to the individual seller and the individual buyer. Those two coming into agreement is what determines the price, because you can't centrally predict how much something is worth and how much someone is willing to pay for it, which is why in a centrally planned economy, the first thing that happens are black markets, because black markets spring up to exploit the inequities in the market. Well, capitalism balances those much more rapidly than a centrally controlled economy ever could, because there's no computer that's good enough to determine whether you're hungry enough, tired enough, and stupid enough to pay $500 for a pair of tennis shoes, right? It can't predict that, right? It's just people's purchasing decisions are inherently unpredictable, which is why centrally planned economies never work, right?
Well, and that's why, like I mentioned to Paul, that I kind of push back against the kind of conservative point of view about individualism, and I think a lot of that is based on just the pure economic philosophy that you just explained. That does function at the level of the individual.
Correct.
But not all aspects of society can function that way. And when we assume that society is a reflection of the economy, that I think that's how we've gotten so far off. And when I say we, I think about like the conservative, environment that I kind of grew up in, and the folks that I used to listen to, and going back to like like Milton Friedman and the idea of like shareholder supremacy. And it's like, we should all focus on success in this way. And it's like, wait, no, that's second. I mean, my motivation is not to make money. My motivation is to reflect my God and to love people, and to love God and love people. Back to the two commandments, right? And if I'm a part of an organization and my main objective isn't to make money, that's not my purpose for existence, and nobody in this organization's purpose for existence is to make money, at what level do we combine to where now all of a sudden our existence is to make money? That doesn't make any sense to me. Like, we should still be functioning, even as organizations, with the same motivation to do good in the world and to make things better, and to, and people will pay for that because it's making their lives better.
Mm-hmm.
But we untangled so much of it, and then just made it all about the individual and my success, and we let the economic pursuits define the cultural or the societal good that whatever Adam Smith said was good for the economy, well, that's good for the society too. And it's like, well, no, that those aren't the same thing. And so that's where
that's what corporations have taken over. And it's the idea that I agree with you totally. Capitalism
that's
but not in a Christian environment. I mean, not without Christianity. So anyway, sorry.
No, I was just going to say that's a bigger discussion, and I think it would be a worthwhile discussion. And I think that I could get Ira to come and join us, and the three of us could, or the four of us, then could talk about this issue of how does capitalism work into all of this in terms of human nature, and in terms of sin, and in terms of what leads us into corporate cronyism and all those kinds of things. I think that'd be a very interesting conversation, which we could do another time if you guys
we've got long,
because we've kind of gone long now. So does that sound good?
Sounds great.
Sure. Yeah.
Get in touch with Ira and see if we can line it up.
Okay.
Sounds good.
So it's really good talking to you guys. Thank you so much.
You too.
Nice to meet you. Have a great time.
Bye-bye.